Today in your lesson, we're going to continue looking at the Constitution and some of the compromises that they ended up making. And today we're going to focus specifically on slavery. And we really want to pay attention to this idea of slavery and how it fits into the Constitution because we're going to focus the rest of our study this year for American history around this idea of slavery and see how slavery affected the country as it grew. Because right from the beginning, slavery was a huge problem. And slavery caused a big divide between northern states and southern states. After the Revolutionary War, a lot of states began to free their slaves, some immediately, some over time. But slavery was never a big thing in the North. They didn't have the huge plantations that they needed that kind of labor. A lot of times they were used as domestic workers, which is people who might work in your house, sometimes in shipbuilding in different places, sometimes on small farms. But there was never a really big need for slavery in the North. So it's not that Northerners were maybe so much better than Southerners, but they didn't really, in their economy, they didn't need slave labor the way that Southerners felt they needed it, okay? Remember, the Southern economy, when the colonies started, they couldn't get the labor. They couldn't get the people to stay and work in those horrible conditions. And so the only way they could grow their plantations was to bring in forced labor and to bring in slaves. So when you get to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, you have the men who are creating the Constitution, who we sometimes call the framers of the Constitution, who this problem of slavery comes up. Thomas Jefferson himself says in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. James Madison comes up with the Virginia Plan. James Madison is a slave owner. George Washington, slave owner. Okay, so some very important people at the Constitutional Convention are slave owners. And so this idea of what to do about slavery causes huge problems and arguments. And it's basically to the point where this whole Constitution thing might not happen if we don't make some sort of agreements or concessions. We don't kind of give in on a few things about slavery. I don't want to give away too much because I want you to explore some of this in the rest of your lesson today. But basically, the solution they come up with is they kind of ignore it. What they're kind of thinking is that, you know, slavery is kind of like this old way of doing things. It'll go away on its own. Okay? Never mind the fact that a lot of people don't even consider slaves to be real people with real feelings, so they're not very concerned about them. But a lot of people say, you know what, it'll go away on its own. It's okay. We'll just let it go for a little while, and then eventually it's going to go away, and we won't really have to deal with it now. We'll deal with it later. Okay, well, later it becomes an even bigger problem, and that's kind of what we're going to learn as we go along. But the Constitution doesn't even use the word slave, but it says things like all other persons not free, forced servitude or involuntary servitude or forced labor and things like that. So it uses words, but they don't even want to use the word slaves in the Constitution. So it uses other words to mean slaves, all persons not free. Okay? So slavery's in there, but they just don't want to say it because deep down they must know that it's just not right. Okay? But they're not willing to give up their slaves. The southern states will not do it. And the northern states are kind of like, we got to get this Constitution passed, and we're just going to have to give in for now. And they say, but we'll do a couple things. We'll stop taking slaves in from Africa in 20 years. We'll postpone it for the future, and we'll deal with it later. So as you're reading today and watching some of the videos, you're going to need to pay attention to what compromises, what things did the framers or the men writing the Constitution decide to do about slavery. Okay, what decisions did they make? How were they going to handle it? I gave you some clues, but I didn't give you all the answers. So I need you to look for those answers as you are doing your lesson today.